My neighbor called the cops to report a squatter stealing power from her HOA gazebo. The deputy arrived, looked at my ID, and started laughing. He didn't arrest me, he asked if I wanted to shut off the entire street. The unauthorized cabin extension wasn't just a minor structural addition or a bit of overzealous DIY. It was the physical manifestation of Brenda's absolute conviction that the mountain, and everything on it, was her personal sandbox. To understand the gravity of the extension, you have to understand the layout of our little slice of the ridge. My cabin sits on a natural shelf, elevated about 50 feet above the valley floor where the rest of the Highland Heights community and HOA that mostly consisted of Brenda's bridge club and a few terrified retirees resided in their manicured log mansions. My property was the original homestead, a rugged, timber-framed structure that had been there since the late 1940s. Because of its historical footprint, it held the primary easement for the local power grid, a fact that Brenda treated as a personal affront to her authority as HOA President. She viewed my cabin not as a home, but as a utility shed that happened to have a porch. The trouble started when Brenda decided that her sprawling estate needed a meditation sanctuary that doubled as a high-end catering gazebo. She had spent the better part of the spring badgering me to sign over a portion of my lower acreage so she could beautify the trail, which is code for build a structure I don't have the permits for on land I don't own. When I politely but firmly told her that my land was under a strict conservation easement and wouldn't be seeing any gazebos, she didn't get angry, she got quiet. In the world of an HOA Karen, silence is the sound of a fuse burning. She decided that if I wouldn't give her the land, she would simply take the resources. She hired a contractor who looked more like a guy she'd met in a hardware store parking lot to build this eyesore of a gazebo right up against my property line, tucked behind a thicket of white pines where she thought I wouldn't notice it during my month-long absences. But a meditation sanctuary needs more than just cedar shingles and a view. Brenda wanted climate-controlled flooring, a wine fridge, and a high-fidelity sound system to blast whale sounds at 5 in the morning. Running a dedicated line from her main house would have required trenching through 300 feet of solid granite, a project that would have cost her upwards of $15,000 and required a permit that the county would never have granted. Brenda, being a problem solver, looked up at my cabin and saw my external heavy-duty workshop outlet, a 240-volt beast designed for industrial saws and welding equipment, sitting there like a lonely ATM. To her, that outlet wasn't my private property. It was a communal asset that I was selfishly hoarding by not being there to use it. She didn't just plug in a little orange household cord. No, Brenda went full industrial. When I pulled into my gravel drive after 3 weeks in the city, the first thing I noticed wasn't the fresh mountain air. It was the hum. It was a low-frequency electrical thrum that seemed to vibrate the very air around my porch. I followed the noise to the side of my house and found a thick, black, rubberized cable, the kind used for outdoor concert stages, snapped firmly into my workshop outlet. It was held in place with duct tape, likely to keep the unauthorized connection from slipping out. From there, the cable dove into the dirt, crudely covered by a layer of pine needles and mulch that wouldn't have fooled a blind squirrel. It snaked down the steep embankment, disappearing into the dense brush of the buffer zone between our properties. I stood there for a moment, genuinely impressed by the audacity. This wasn't a neighbor asking to borrow a cup of sugar. This was a neighbor staging a full-scale raid on my infrastructure. I walked to the edge of the ridge and looked down through my binoculars. There it was, the sanctuary. It was lit up like a Christmas tree in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. I could see the glow of the wine fridge and hear the faint, rhythmic thumping of a subwoofer. Brenda had effectively turned my cabin into a giant battery for her hobby room. The unauthorized nature of it went beyond the theft of power. It was a massive fire hazard. The cable was draped over dry brush and tinder dry needles during one of the hottest summers on record. If that line had sparked, the entire ridge would have gone up in flames, starting with my grandfather's cabin. As I stood there, I realized she had even gone so far as to install a fake utility box on the side of my house to camouflage where the cord met the outlet. She had painted it to match my siding, likely hoping that if I saw it from a distance, I'd just assume it was some new piece of equipment installed by the actual power company. The level of premeditation was staggering. She hadn't just tripped over a cord and decided to use it. She had planned a tactical utility heist. She had waited for my truck to leave the county, coordinated a contractor to lay the line, and then proceeded to run her lavish outdoor lifestyle on my dime, all while likely drafting a memo to the neighborhood about how my cluttered porch was a violation of Article 4, Section 2 of her imaginary HOA bylaws. What Brenda didn't realize was that my cabin's electrical system was monitored by a smart grid pilot program because, again, I own the company. My phone had been pinging me for 2 weeks about an unusual sustained load on the workshop circuit. I had assumed it was a faulty heater or a short in the old wiring. But seeing that black snake disappearing into the woods confirmed a much more annoying reality. She had treated my home like a public utility. And in doing so, she had crossed the one line you never cross with a man who understands the complexities of the electrical grid. She wasn't just stealing cents. She was pulling enough amperage to run a small machine shop. And she was doing it with a sense of total moral superiority. I reached down and gripped the plug. I knew that the second I pulled it, I wasn't just turning off a light. I was declaring war. I could almost picture the scene inside the gazebo. The wine fridge dying. The whale sounds cutting off into a pathetic electronic screech. And Brenda, sitting there in her Lululemon gear, realizing that the free ride was over. I didn't just unplug it. I called the cord up, foot by foot, dragging it out from under her pathetic mulch camouflage like a hunter pulling a snake out of a hole. By the time I had the first 50 feet coiled on my porch, I heard the distant slam of a car door and the unmistakable sound of a high-pitched, indignant scream echoing up the valley. The unauthorized cabin extension was officially closed for business, and the president of the HOA was about to stage a counter-offensive that she would regret for the rest of her life. The silence that followed the disconnection of the industrial cable lasted for perhaps 30 seconds. A brief, deceptive window of mountain tranquility before the storm broke. I was still standing on my porch, the heavy black coil of the extension cord sitting at my feet like a captured deep-sea serpent, when the first shriek echoed up from the ravine. It wasn't a cry of alarm. It was a cry of perceived violation. To Brenda, the loss of power wasn't a technical failure, it was a personal assault on her sovereignty. I watched through the thinning pines as her white SUV tore up the gravel access road, kicking up a plume of dust that signaled her arrival long before she screeched to a halt inches from my porch steps. She didn't even turn off the engine before she was out of the car, slamming the door with a force that rattled the quiet air of the ridge. Brenda was dressed in what I can only describe as aggressive lesser wear. A coordinated tracksuit that suggested she was ready for a yoga retreat but prepared for a cage match. Her face was already a vibrant shade of magenta, her eyes darting immediately to the outlet on the side of my cabin. When she saw the empty socket and the neatly coiled cord at my feet, her jaw tightened so hard I thought I heard her teeth grind. She didn't start with a "Welcome back," or a "Hello, neighbor." She marched up my stairs, invading my personal space until she was standing just one step below me, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. She began a tirade that was less of a conversation and more of a scripted monologue she had clearly been rehearsing in her head for months, fueled by the absolute certainty that her position as HOA President granted her eminent domain over the very laws of physics. "How dare you?" she bellowed, her voice cracking with the sheer volume of her entitlement. "Do you have any idea what you just did? I am in the middle of hosting the regional committee for the beautification of the Highlands. We have guests. We have catering. We have a delicate ambience that you just shattered because of your petty, selfish need for control." I stood my ground, leaning casually against the porch railing, which only seemed to infuriate her further. I pointed at the cord and asked her quite simply what she thought she was doing connecting her gazebo to my private workshop circuit. Her response was a masterpiece of mental gymnastics. She claimed that because my cabin was underutilized and frequently vacant, it constituted a community resource drain, according to a vague, probably non-existent clause in the HOA bylaws regarding shared infrastructure. She argued that since my property sat on the primary electrical easement for the ridge, the power coming into my cabin was technically neighborhood property until it passed through a meter she deemed legitimate. According to Brenda's twisted logic, my private residence was merely a pass-through for the Highland Heights energy supply, and my refusal to share was a form of hoarding that bordered on criminal. She actually told me, with a straight face, that by unplugging her line, I was sabotaging a communal event, and that she would be levying a daily fine against me for every hour her wine fridge remained unpowered. It was a staggering display of audacity. She wasn't just defending her theft. She was gaslighting me into believing that I was the one stealing from her by reclaiming my own electricity. The confrontation escalated when I told her to get off my property and take her industrial-grade hazard with her. Brenda didn't retreat. She doubled down. She claimed that she had authorized the connection during an emergency session of the HOA board, a board that consisted of her sister-in-law, and a neighbor who was currently in a nursing home because my cabin's exterior aesthetic was bringing down property values. In her mind, using my power to run her luxury gazebo was a form of taxation. I owed the neighborhood for my cabin's rugged, unpainted cedar siding. She began pacing my porch, her heels clicking aggressively on the wood. As she pulled out her phone, she told me that she had already warned the local authorities that I was a difficult and potentially unstable homeowner who was interfering with the essential maintenance of the community's grid. As she paced, she started recording me with her phone, holding it up like a shield. "Look at this," she said to her followers or her imaginary audience. "Here is the resident of Unit 14, actively harassing a board member and cutting off vital utilities to a community structure. This is a clear violation of the peace and a direct threat to the safety of our mountain ecosystem." I realized then that Brenda didn't just want the power. She wanted the drama. She wanted to cast herself as the martyr of the mountains, the brave woman standing up to the mountain hermit who refused to play by her rules. Every time I tried to speak, she would talk over me, her voice rising in pitch and volume, citing Article 7, subsection B, of a handbook I knew for a fact didn't cover electrical theft. The most surreal part of the confrontation was her insistence that the power company, the very one I presided over, had verbally approved her connection. She claimed she had spoken to a representative who told her that since my cabin was on a legacy meter, the HOA had the right to divert surplus energy for communal projects. I knew this was a lie because I personally sign off on every legacy meter audit in this zip code. But watching her lie with such conviction was almost fascinating. She was so deep in her own fantasy of authority that she truly believed her HOA title gave her the power to overwrite state utility laws. She threatened to have my illegal cabin condemned if I didn't plug the cord back in immediately. She even reached for the cord on the floor, attempting to grab it and shove it back into the outlet while I was standing right there. I blocked her path, not with force, but by simply stepping in front of the outlet. That was the breaking point. Brenda let out a sound that was half gasp, half growl, and screamed that she was calling the sheriff. She claimed I had physically intimidated her and that she felt unsafe on my property, the property she had trespassed on to steal electricity. She began a frantic 911 call, reporting a trespasser on HOA-managed lands who was tampering with the power lines. As she stood there on my porch, breathless and shaking with rage, she looked at me with a smirk of triumph, convinced that the arrival of the law would finally put me in my place. She had no idea that she had just invited the one person who could document her fraud into the middle of her crime scene. She was so focused on winning the confrontation at the outlet that she didn't realize she was handing me the evidence I needed to dismantle her little mountain empire forever. "Gemini said, The arrival of the high-visibility light bar cutting through the mountain mist was exactly the theatrical climax Brenda had been praying for. As the cruiser crunched over the gravel of my driveway, she didn't just meet the deputy. She launched herself toward him like a Victorian heroine fleeing a burning building. The blue lights and bold claims phase of the afternoon had begun, and Brenda was determined to ensure the narrative was written in her favor before the cruiser door even swung open. Deputy Miller, a man I had known for nearly a decade and who had likely spent more time mediating Brenda's picket fence disputes than chasing actual criminals, climbed out with a heavy sigh that spoke volumes. He didn't look like a man arriving at a crime scene. He looked like a man who had forgotten his headache medication. Brenda didn't give him a chance to adjust his belt. She began a rapid-fire delivery of accusations that were as imaginative as they were legally incoherent. She claimed that I was illegally obstructing the flow of essential community utilities and that my presence at the cabin I had owned for 15 years, was a violation of the peace. During a scheduled HOA summit, she used words like infrastructure sabotage and endangerment of public safety, pointing wildly at the coiled black cord on my porch as if it were a smoking gun. To an outsider, her conviction might have been convincing. She had that polished, practiced tone of someone who spent her Sunday nights highlighting bylaws and dreaming of municipal power. She told the deputy that the gazebo down the hill was a designated emergency shelter, and that by cutting the power, I was putting the entire neighborhood at risk of a localized catastrophe. The deputy held up a hand, trying to stem the tide of her jargon. He looked up at me on the porch, his eyes weary. "Sir," he said, "Brenda here says you re-tampering with the neighborhood's electrical grid and that you've created a hazardous environment by disconnecting a communal line." "What's the story?" Before I could even draw breath to answer, Brenda cut in, her voice hitting a glass-shattering soprano. She claimed that the HOA had a historical easement that granted them full access to any exterior outlet on the ridge during peak social seasons. She told the deputy that I was a seasonal squatter who didn't understand the collective stewardship required to maintain a luxury mountain community. Her boldest claim, however, was that the power coming into my house wasn't actually mine, because the meter on the side of the cabin was obsolete and unrecognized by the board. I stood there, arms crossed, watching as she dug a hole so deep she'd need a ladder to see the sky. She told the deputy that she had documentation from the power company stating that my cabin's electrical footprint was actually communal surplus. When the deputy asked to see this documentation, she began fumbling with her phone, claiming the PDF was loading, or that it was protected by a board-level password. It was a classic Brenda move, asserting a lie with such ferocity that she expected the sheer volume of her voice to serve as proof. She then pivoted to a more personal attack, telling the officer that I had threatened her when she tried to restore the service. I had vandalized. She was painting a picture of a rogue mountain man who had gone off the deep end, sabotaging the very lights that kept the community safe. The deputy, to his credit, walked over to the coiled cord. He examined the heavy-duty plug and the duct tape residue I hadn't yet scrubbed off my outlet. He looked down the hill at the glowing, albeit now darkening, gazebo and then back at the fake utility box Brenda had installed to hide her theft. He wasn't a utility expert, but he was a man of common sense. He asked Brenda, "If this is a communal line, why is it plugged into a residential workshop outlet with an extension cord hidden under pine needles?" Brenda didn't blink. She claimed it was a temporary bypass, necessitated by my refusal to cooperate with the board's modernization initiative. She insisted that the HOA had the right to appropriate private assets for the aesthetic and functional benefit of the Highland Heights residents. At this point, Brenda's claims reached the level of the absurd. She began lecturing the deputy on the revised statutes of mountain governance, a document that I am fairly certain she wrote herself on a Tuesday afternoon after a second glass of Chardonnay. She told him that if he didn't arrest me, or at least force me to plug the cord back in, she would report him to the sheriff for Dereliction of duty. She was so convinced of her own status as the Queen of the Ridge that she truly believed the law was a tool she could wield against anyone who inconvenienced her. She stood there in the flickering blue light of the cruiser, her shadow stretching long and distorted against the side of my cabin, looking like a caricature of suburban tyranny. I watched the deputy's face shift from exhaustion to genuine annoyance. He knew, as I did, that there was no communal surplus. He knew that an extension cord running through a forest was a fire code violation of the highest order. But Brenda was relentless. She started calling out to her witnesses. Down the hill, the three confused women from her brunch who were now standing on her deck, watching the blue lights with a mix of horror and fascination. They saw it. Brenda cried. They saw him violently rip the cord out. They saw the sparks. He asked the danger to the grid. There were no sparks. Of course, I had flipped the breaker before touching the cord, a detail that would soon become very relevant. The blue lights and bold claims. Phase was reaching its boiling point. Brenda was now demanding that the deputy escort me off the mountain so she could safely reconnect the infrastructure. She was talking as if she were a general leading a liberation force against a foreign occupier. The sheer scale of her delusion was almost admirable if it wasn't so incredibly illegal. She had managed to turn a simple case of utility theft into a grand narrative of community defense, casting herself as the hero and me as the villain who wanted to leave the world in darkness. She was so busy being the protagonist of her own movie that she failed to notice I hadn't said more than 10 words the entire time. I was just waiting for her to finish. I was waiting for her to provide every single piece of self-incriminating evidence the deputy would need to file a report that would stick. As she pointed at the meter one last time, screaming that it was unauthorized junk, I realized the moment had finally come to drop the curtain on her performance. The I am the manager moment didn't happen with a shout or a dramatic flourish. It happened with the click of a briefcase latch and the terrifyingly calm silence of a man who holds all the cards. Brenda was still mid-sentence, lecturing the deputy on the moral obligations of mountain residency and how my obsolete meter was a stain on the neighborhood's progressive utility plan. When I reached into the passenger seat of my truck and pulled out a leather-bound corporate portfolio, this wasn't just a collection of property deeds. It was the documented history of the very electrons flowing through the copper wires of the entire county. I stepped off the porch, descending the stairs slowly until I was standing on the gravel, level with the deputy and Brenda. The look on Brenda's face was one of smug anticipation. She truly believed I was reaching for a checkbook to pay a fine, or perhaps a white flag of surrender. I opened the folder and pulled out a single high-gloss business card and a certified copy of the state's utility regulatory filing. I handed the card to the deputy first. He looked at it, his eyes squinting in the fading light. And then he looked at me with a slow, realizing grin. I then turned to Brenda, who was peering over his shoulder, her nose wrinkled as if she were smelling something unpleasant. I didn't wait for her to ask. I began to speak in the tone I usually reserve for boardrooms, flat, precise, and utterly devoid of emotion. Brenda, I said, you've spent the last 20 minutes talking about the Mountain Electric Cooperative as if it's a public park or a community garden that you have a key to. You've told the officer that this meter is unauthorized junk and that the board has the right to divert communal surplus energy. I paused, letting the mountain wind carry my words down toward her dark, unpowered gazebo. The Mountain Electric Cooperative isn't a government entity, and it certainly isn't an HOA subsidiary. It was founded in 1947 by my grandfather, Silas Vane, to bring power to these ridges when the big state plants refused to run lines up the granite. It is a private, family-held utility corporation, and as of 3 years ago, following my father's retirement, I am the majority shareholder, the chairman of the board, and the acting CEO of the company that owns every pole, every transformer, and every inch of high-tension wire you can see from this porch. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was heavy. It was the kind of silence that happens right before a dam breaks. Brenda's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her heroic Posture slumped, her shoulders creeping up toward her ears as the reality of her situation began to settle into her bones like the evening chill. I directed the deputy's attention to the third page of the portfolio, a detailed map of the Ridge's infrastructure. Officer, I continued, what we have here isn't a neighborly dispute over a communal resource. What we have is a documented case of Class B felony utility fraud. This extension cord wasn't just plugged into my house. It was a deliberate bypass of a commercial-grade residential meter. By claiming the HOA authorized this, Brenda has admitted to a conspiracy to misappropriate corporate assets. Every watt of power she used to chill her Chardonnay and blast her whale sounds was stolen directly from my company's bottom line. And since she has been doing this for 3 weeks, according to the smart load alerts on my phone, the total value of the diverted energy, combined with the damages for the fire hazard she created, puts this well into the range of a criminal indictment. Brenda finally found her voice, though it was now 3 octaves higher and lacked any of its former presidential authority. You can't own the power company, she stammered, her eyes darting between the deputy and the corporate seal on the documents. That's a conflict of interest. You're a member of the HOA. You're supposed to serve the community. I couldn't help but let out a small, dry laugh. I explained to her that being a member of an HOA doesn't give the board the right to seize private corporate property any more than it gives them the right to steal my truck because they need to move some mulch. I pointed out that my obsolete meter was actually a state-of-the-art monitoring node that had been recording her theft in real time, timestamping every time her wine fridge kicked on and every time her meditation speakers drew a spike in amperage. The deputy, who was now thoroughly enjoying the reversal of fortunes, cleared his throat. So, Brenda, he said, tapping the business card against his palm, it sounds like you've been stealing from the man who literally signs the checks for the people who maintain your lights. That's a bold strategy. Brenda tried one last, desperate gambit. She claimed that she had intended to pay for the power and that she was simply testing the load for a future community project. I cut her off before she could finish the lie. I pulled out a final sheet of paper, a list of delinquent accounts in the Highland Heights subdivision. Funny you should mention payment, Brenda, because while I was reviewing the logs on my way up here, I noticed that the Highland Heights HOA common area account is currently 60 days past due. It seems the president has been so busy building unauthorized gazebos that she forgot to pay the actual electric bill for the streetlights and the entry gate. I am the manager. Moment was complete. I wasn't just a neighbor she could bully with fake bylaws. I was the entity that provided the very lifeblood of her modern existence. I told her that, as the CEO, I was now initiating a safety and integrity audit of every property in the HOA. If my technicians found a single unmetered wire or a tapped transformer, which I suspected she had encouraged others to do, I would not only press charges, but I would also petition the State Utility Commission to designate the entire subdivision as a high-risk fire zone, which would effectively quintuple her insurance premiums overnight. Brenda looked like she wanted to melt into the gravel. The woman who had arrived as a lion was now looking for any way to exit like a mouse. I looked at the deputy and told him I wanted a full police report filed for the theft of services and the trespassing. I didn't want her arrested right then. I wanted the paper trail. I wanted the HOA board to see a police report with their president's name on it as the primary suspect in a felony utility heist. I watched as the deputy began to write, his pen scratching across the paper in the glow of the blue lights, while Brenda stood there, frozen, realizing that the greater good she had been preaching was about to cost her everything. She had tried to steal power from a mountain cabin, only to find out that she had accidentally tried to rob the man who owned the mountain's son. Gemini said, the dark side of entitlement is a peculiar phenomenon. It thrives in the sunlight of perceived authority but shrivels with terrifying speed when exposed to the cold, hard vacuum of a superior reality. As the deputy finished his notes and the blue lights continued to pulse against the trees, the transformation of Brenda was complete. The woman who had marched up my driveway like an invading general was now vibrating with a frantic, twitchy energy. She wasn't just losing an argument. She was watching the entire foundation of her social identity, the benevolent dictator of the ridge, dissolve in real time. The entitlement that had allowed her to believe she could simply manifest an electrical connection out of thin air was now curdling into a desperate, feral kind of self-preservation. She began to babble. And this is where the true darkness of her entitlement showed its teeth. It wasn't enough that she had been caught. She now needed to spread the blame like a contagion. She turned toward her witnesses, the three ladies from the brunch who were still hovering near the gazebo, and began shouting that they had encouraged her. She claimed the entire HOA board had voted on the bypass in an executive session, a blatant lie that would, by morning, turn her remaining allies into her fiercest enemies. Entitlement, when cornered, always looks for a scapegoat. She was willing to burn down the reputation of every person in the subdivision if it meant she could pretend she was just a misguided public servant, instead of a common thief with a high-end tracksuit. I watched her with a mixture of pity and clinical detachment. I informed her that the safety and integrity audit I had mentioned wasn't just a threat. It was already being dispatched. I pulled out my phone and, right in front of her, dialed my chief of field operations. I told him to have a crew at the Highland Heights gate by 8:00 a.m. the next morning to begin service verification and fraud detection. For every unit, Brenda's face went from magenta to a ghostly, sickly gray. She knew what that meant. In her quest to beautify the neighborhood, she had played fast and loose with more than just my workshop outlet. There were rumors of heated driveways tapped into the street lamp circuits and hot tubs that never seemed to reflect on a monthly bill. By stealing from me, she had accidentally invited a vampire into the blood bank. She had brought the one person who could count every electron directly to the doorstep of her fraudulent empire. The fallout was instantaneous. As the deputy handed me the case number and prepared to leave, Brenda tried to make a final, pathetic stand. She suggested that we could settle this as neighbors, and that she was willing to overlook my cabin-s sighting if I would just cancel the audit. It was the ultimate Karen move, offering to stop her harassment in exchange for immunity for her crimes. I simply looked at her and said, Brenda, the time for neighborly disputes ended when you duct-taped an industrial fire hazard to my house. Now, you're re-dealing with a utility provider, and the provider doesn't negotiate with people who bypass the meter. I told her that her personal power would remain on for now, but only until the audit was complete. If we found a single violation at her main lodge, her service would be disconnected for safety reasons until she could provide a certified electrical inspection, a process that, in this county, takes months. The true darkness, however, came the following week. The news that the power company CEO lived in the eyesore cabin spread through the HOA like a brush fire. The board, realizing Brenda had implicated them in a felony conspiracy during her rant to the deputy, turned on her with a ferocity that was almost Shakespearean. They held an emergency meeting, ironically, without power, because I had pulled the delinquent Common Area Account S service and voted 4-0 to remove her as president and strip her of her architectural oversight powers. She was no longer the enforcer. She was a pariah. The woman who had spent years measuring the height of people's grass was now facing a mountain of legal fees, a criminal investigation for utility fraud, and the very real possibility of a civil suit from my corporation. I spent the next Saturday sitting on my porch, finally enjoying the silence I had bought the property for. Down the hill, I could see Brenda's lodge. There were no whale sounds echoing through the trees. There was no new guest gazebo glowing in the twilight. In fact, the gazebo had been dismantled. The contractor she had hired had apparently fled the state when he heard a utility CEO was looking into his handiwork. Brenda herself was nowhere to be seen, her white SUV hidden in her garage, likely as she spent her days on the phone with lawyers. She had tried to steal power, but in the end, she had lost all of it: her social power, her political power, And quite literally, your electrical power. The entitlement that leads someone to think they can own a mountain they didn't climb is a dangerous thing. It blinds them to the reality that everyone has a role to play. And some of those roles come with very large folders of legal documentation. As the sun dipped below the ridge and the automatic streetlights, now legally and properly accounted for, flickered to life, I realized that the mountain was finally quiet. The HOA was terrified of me. Brenda was broken, and my workshop outlet was capped with a steel locking cover that not even a bolt cutter could easily defeat. I had come for peace, and I had found it, though ID had to go through a Karen to get there. The mountain shadow meltdown was over, and for the first time in 3 years, the only thing humming on the ridge was the wind through the pines. Gemini said, if you enjoyed this ultimate Karen reality check, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Don't miss out on the next time an entitled neighbor learns exactly who they messing with. Drop a like in the comments if you want to see the legal notice follow-up.